Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. If inspiration is the currency of change, then I can confidently say that all of us are significantly richer since 3 hours ago. The interventions this morning have been absolutely brilliant, and I just feel not just enriched in mind, but really with the soul rich with the energy, the power we need to go out and make change in the world. And I say this particularly because I belong to two countries that have defined rights and resistance in very remarkable ways in the world, both India and South Africa. And as many of you Norwegians, sit here and you take pride in what your country does in the global stage for democracy and rights, remember that the privilege also comes with accountability. Most of us who've been part of generations and cultures where we grew up seeing our leaders talk about democracy and rights, that reality shifts quite quickly. And there's a huge responsibility on us to continue to protect that, to continue to connect and continue to act in very visible and tangible ways on what we believe in. So thank you really for having me here and many of my, the colleagues and activists who've spoken already and will speak after. So having said that, I'm going to say that today is a really important moment for CIVICUS as well, because we are launching our brand new report, which was actually created for the purpose of the Norad Conference here. And I have the privilege of really representing 20 research organizations and networks who've contributed to this report in highlighting a few of the kind of headlines. Now, I'm really not the best at eye-to-hand coordination, so I have my speaking notes in one hand, a clicker in the other, and I have to speak. So please bear with me if I kind of fumble along the way. But just to say that this report really is, what we've done is we've looked at 5 years of the CIVICUS Monitor. The CIVICUS Monitor is a participatory research platform that tracks the status of civic space across 198 countries and territories. So that's more contexts or countries than in the United Nations. And what we do is we track the status of the three fundamental civic freedoms: the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly or the right to protest, and the freedom of association. So the ability really to form the organizations, associations, groups, movements, even community kind of affiliations that actually make it possible for people across the world, whether they're citizens or non-citizens, to actually engage with public policy, to talk about what's important to them. So just going ahead. Oh, okay. Now, has it shifted? No. Sorry, I'm going to have to ask someone to help me shift this. Ah, there it is. OK, great. So I'm going to start by just talking about what the report says in relation to where people live. The CIVICUS Monitor, platform looks at 5 stages in which countries are ranked according to the state of civic freedoms. So that ranges from open, which is the green category, to closed, which is the category you see in red. So 5 years ago, 3% of the world's population lived in open categories. So these are contexts where the 3 civic freedoms I mentioned are actually formally and normatively upheld. So these are the countries where people can freely exercise all of their civic freedoms, and the exercise of those freedoms is also protected constitutionally, by law, by public opinion, and by political actions. The fact that we've actually had a 1% decline in terms of how many people know what it is like to freely exercise those freedoms, and many of you sitting here are part of those, those few countries that actually now know what that feels like on a day-to-day basis, is worrying. Because if we remain on this trend, then in the next 10 years, we could be the last generation that actually understands what it means to actually exercise those freedoms. And that's extremely concerning for us. I'm sure we'll be around in 10 years, but of course for future generations. And like Iyad and Hindu both mentioned in the morning, the destruction happens in one generation, but the consequences really belong to the future generations and really undoes their ability to thrive and live freely in the world. On the other side, if you look at the red and the orange, margins, the shift really has been that 70% of the world's population now lives in contexts where the absence of civic freedom is completely normalized. So for 7 out of 10 people across the world live on a day-to-day basis in spaces, and I think I can relate to that keenly as somebody from India, where it is perfectly normal to be criticized, trolled, publicly condemned for just stating something that's evidence, and for expressing dissent or disagreement with what either state or non-state actors who are in power want the world to believe. And the fact that in closed countries in particular, the consequences can be severe to fatal. So you can be arrested, you can be attacked, and you can even lose your life simply for disagreeing with the kind of policy line or the the line that people in economic and political power would hold at that given point in time. And I know that many people around the room, especially including people who will be taking the stage after me, are very familiar with that being a day-to-day reality, and that should not be the kind of life that anybody lives on the planet. I'm just going to touch upon a few of the trends that we've picked out, and I want to focus specifically on 2 regions. One, as you can see, globally, there's been a shift in terms of the number of closed countries from 24 to 28, but it's not all bad news. There were actually a couple of countries that, 10 of them actually, that were upgraded from the closed category earlier, and then a couple more that, that came in. Sorry, so it was 6 countries that were improved from the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, and the south of Sahara African regions. And then there were 10 new countries that actually moved into the closed category, and I'll speak to them a little later. The 2 regions that I'd really like to focus on are Europe and then Africa south of Sahara. So in Europe, I think it's important to really talk about how things are changing and how things have changed in the last 5 years. As somebody who's spent most of my life in either Asia or Africa, we're kind of used to going to spaces and being told how bad things are where we live, but things are bad across the world, and I think that's something that needs to unite us and connect us in our change effort. So 10 European countries have been downgraded in the last 5 years alone. This includes 4 countries who moved from the open to the narrowed country, category, and that includes Belgium and Germany. Germany was downgraded just last year. 4 countries who've moved from narrowed to obstructed, which includes Poland and UK. UK, again, has been on the watch list and downgraded in the last 5 years. And then 2 countries have actually moved into the closed category, so that's Belarus and Russia. I think the biggest headline there is that in 2019, close to 60% of Europe's population lived in countries that were either open or narrow, so in the top half of the Civicus Monitor ratings. Now, 55% of Europe's population lives in countries in the bottom half of the rating, so that's in obstructed, restricted, and closed countries. So the message really is, please do not take your civic freedoms for granted. They actually change much faster than you would imagine, and I'll come back to that a little later. The trends that have actually caused a lot of these downgrades in Europe are quite familiar, are things we're familiar with. The rise in and crackdown on climate activists and movements is one of the top trends in Europe. There's an unbelievable intolerance towards climate activism, and Norway is in fact one of the countries which has imposed the highest financial penalties on young activists organizing on climate issues. Investigations of organizations on the pretext of looking into counterterrorism and money laundering kind of violations is another trend that we've seen in Europe. And then finally, and I think again something sadly we're all too familiar with, the criminalization of humanitarian efforts, which has been unprecedented. I mean, never since World War II has there been as much pushback on humanitarian organizations as we are seeing now, especially humanitarian organizations that work with migrants and refugees. So moving on. Oh, OK, this is still the same slide. I just have to move on this hand. So moving on to Africa south of the Sahara. there is actually some good news. So there was a decrease in the number of closed countries. So the number of countries in the red on the African continent, south of Sahara, actually decreased from, it was 8 countries who were closed in 2019, and it's now 3 countries in 2023. So I think that speaks hugely also to the rise of civil society action, activism, and youth activism on the continent. There has, however, been an increase in the movement from the obstructed countries to the repressed. So in the obstructed countries, you generally have a lot of the normative kind of variables of civic space restrictions, so that the environment, the public and political environment to close down civic space are actually in play. You have political figures talking about why civil society is not a good thing to have, why they're anti-national, why they need to be closed down. But in the repressed countries, that's where you see all of the legislations and the restrictions actually being formalized, and a lot of the punitive actions take place. So 6 countries actually moved into that category, and 90% of the population in Africa lives in obstructed or repressed spaces. There are actually 5 countries which belong to the green and the light yellow category, which is open or narrowed. And these are the 4 island states in Africa and Namibia. So there are examples on the continent of what it looks like, what good civic space looks like, and it would be really important for us to keep enforcing that, particularly when we're countering the Western, foreign influence narrative of civil society. Civil society and civic freedoms do exist on the African continent, and we can do a lot more to connect the dots on where they actually are a part of the political and public culture. I'm going to just move on to the next slide, and this is really about one of the overarching trends we've seen in the last 5 years, which is the attacks on protests, and specifically on protesters. The interesting thing, I think, for this conference is that 30% actually of the incidents of attacks on protesters that we have actually documented is from open and narrowed countries. So, I mean, of course, protest movements and protesters are being punished and attacked and arrested in the rest of the world. But in the open and narrowed countries, the fact that there is a significant number of those incidents happening here as well is cause for concern, and something we need to do much more about. There is certainly a trend of increased intolerance towards nonviolent civil disobedience in Europe, for instance, and in the United States, and in other parts of the world where we feel that democracy is being upheld. And again, climate activism and the penalties and the punishments meted out to climate activists and indigenous activists is really a case in point. The next highlight really is the prosecution of human rights defenders, and the fact that there is actually the number of countries where we've recorded the arrest and kind of formal action taken against human rights defenders doubled in the last 5 years. So there were 36 countries where these incidents were recorded in 2019, and there are 66 countries in which they've been recorded in 2023. So more and more governments are now not just being more critical of human rights defenders, they're actually using their own agencies and resources to make sure that the consequences are felt as part of the legal system, but also as part of actions taken against their families, their organizations, and the price you pay really for speaking up is something that is unaffordable really in terms of how you live your life and how your family lives their lives. So I think it's notable that the regions where the prosecution of human rights defenders is the highest is actually the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, and Asia Pacific, particularly with countries like China, India, Vietnam, and Thailand. So that is certainly something that's being used very consistently as a deterrent to civil society and civic action. And I think the second last point really is which groups are most affected. And I know that Bart Vegar spoke about this in his intervention as well. But when we are in countries where religious minorities, LGBT plus groups, women's sexual and reproductive rights are being questioned, you can be very, very certain that the next target is all of the groups who are not those excluded groups. Excluded groups in every part of the world are the first project for civic space restrictions and the shutdown or decline of democracy. So it becomes absolutely important for us in the context of rights and resistance to show solidarity, to speak up, not just about the groups we represent, but for all groups and for the indivisibility of rights, right? The universality of rights. And I think the need, therefore, for these kind of connections, these kind of conversations, and our ability to define new and innovative ways in which we connect and express global solidarity is extremely important. We do track civil society's successes on an annual basis as well. And one of the most effective strategies of movements that have won significant outcomes, including climate, women's and LGBT plus movements, is transnational solidarity. There's really no alternative to that, and we must invest much more strongly in it. So I'm just going to end by saying that it's not all doom and gloom. These are quite harsh headlines. But we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be talking to each other if change wasn't possible. So there has actually been several instances of tangible change. And most of these are actually from countries which are significantly less visible on the global stage. And I think it really, again, points to that point, to the need for transnational solidarity. So measures, for instance, such as laws on access to information and the adoption of national human rights strategies and action plans. The Gambia and Tajikistan are examples of that in the last 5 years. The DRC in Africa and Mongolia have actually implemented laws to protect human rights defenders. And of course, we had, prior to 2019, a regional framework for environmental human rights defenders in Latin America as well. The decriminalization of same-sex relations has also been something that several countries have done. And then, of course, the most recent event of taking cases to the International Court of Justice. And I think we've seen that in the case of Myanmar, as well as in the case of Israel. And that continues to be a strategy that we must lean into. So I'm just going to end there. There's going to be opportunity to talk a lot more about what has worked. But with thanks again to the worldwide network of research organizations who have made this possible, and we really look forward to extending as much as we can in terms of information and resources for the work that all of you do on the ground. Thank you.